All right, so why don't we get started? Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Young, the founder of Untapped New York. Justin is with us as well. And I'm very pleased today to introduce Janice Nimura, the author of the new book, The Doctors Blackwell, How Two Pioneering Sisters Brought Medicine to Women and Women to Medicine. I've had a copy of the book and I'm speeding through it. And there's a lot of great New York City connections and history and all the things you guys love. And we're really, really pleased to be able to have her here to give us a presentation and talk about the book. And there will be time for Q&A as well. So, of course, please put your questions into the chat or the Q&A section. We already have someone who said she read the book. Hi, Marie, and it was great. So, Janice, I assume you're going to pull up a presentation?
Yep. Shall I do that
great.
now?
Yeah.
All right. All righty.
And great. And we also put a link in the chat to buy the book on Janice's website. So you can check that out as well. Great. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Michelle.
Yeah.
And the invisible Justin.
He'll be back.
Thank you to all the Untapped insiders. I'm a New Yorker. I am a fourth generation New Yorker coming to you live from East 89th Street tonight. And curious to know where you are all on this evening, or whether we have any nostalgic New Yorkers elsewhere. So the Blackwells, you may be familiar with the name Elizabeth Blackwell. Here they are. Usually followed by the phrase first woman doctor. She was the first woman in America to receive a medical diploma in 1849. Her sister Emily, there on the right, followed her to become the third woman to receive an American medical degree in 1854. And together they founded the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children, and then the Women's Medical College of the New York Infirmary. That's probably as much as you know if you are familiar with their names. I encountered the Blackwell story for the first time 5 years ago. This, despite the fact that I was born and raised here in New York City, went to a proudly feminist all-girls school my whole life, was the math science kid there, graduated intending to be pre-med. I swerved. I couldn't believe that I had never heard of them. How is it possible? So I went looking to figure out who these people were. And what I discovered was what many of you probably thought when you saw the topic of tonight's talk, which was, oh, I had a book about Elizabeth Blackwell when I was 7. She's a lot easier to find on the children's biography shelf. And Emily is rarely there at all. The books in the children's section tend to look like this. This is one from the 40s, an inspirational tale for girls. Slender, attractive young woman with a stethoscope. Here's a middle grade version. This is in my daughter's school library. Again, slender, attractive with a stethoscope. Here's the picture book version, slightly younger and perkier, but there's the stethoscope. All of the children's versions look like this. They're sanitized. All of the contradictions and complexities are all smoothed away. And I was really curious as I got deeper into the primary source material and found that they weren't particularly perky or pretty. I was more interested in who these women really were. I mean, frankly, even if they, first of all, they were never photographed holding stethoscopes. And even if they had been, when they were young and slim, the stethoscopes, first of all, they looked like this when they were older. But when they were as young as the women in all of those picture books, the stethoscopes would have looked like this. So there was nothing particularly accurate about this portrayal. It was very sort of cartoonish and saintly. And I got very curious about what was the whole story, not just what fits in a picture book, not just what fits on a plaque. So what is that story? Briefly, the Blackwell siblings, 8 out of the 9 of them, were born in Bristol, England. Their father was a paradox. He was someone who had made his money in the sugar industry. Bristol was a sugar port. And he was also a passionate abolitionist. Think about that for a second. Sugar, enslaved labor, And this was a man who spent his free time working against slavery. He was a dreamer who wanted to revolutionize the sugar industry so that it was based on beets, sugar beets, not cane, and could be grown in the North and not with enslaved labor. And on the strength of that dream, he moved his family from Bristol all the way to America via New York, and then all the way out to the remote frontier town of Cincinnati in 1838, with this idea that maybe he could find a way to grow sugar beets. He got his family all the way out to Cincinnati, and then he, before they even finished unpacking, died broke, leaving a wife, a widow, and 9 children with about $20. His final lesson to his daughters, who he had educated to the same level as his sons, was a husband is no guarantee of security. None of his 5 daughters ever married. Elizabeth, on the left there, was born in 1821. She was voraciously brilliant, socially quite awkward, and blessed with a healthy sense of self-worth. She admired the transcendentalist writer Margaret Fuller, the writer and editor who had just in the 1840s, when Elizabeth was coming of age, published a bestseller called Woman in the 19th Century. And in her book, she argued that women could be anything they wanted to be by virtue of effort and talent, nothing to do with their sex. Women could be sea captains if they wanted to be. And humanity was not going to rise to a new level of enlightenment until women claimed their power, proved their worth, their strength, their independence. And Elizabeth, really, that resonated with her. She saw herself as the kind of person who could be the woman that Margaret Fuller described, this beacon that by virtue of her accomplishment could lead not just women, but humanity to a higher level. This was not an understated individual. She thought big. She thought, my achievements could lead women and humanity toward the light. So she chose medicine, not because she was particularly drawn to healing or nurturing or even science. She thought sickness was a sign of weakness. She thought bodily functions were disgusting. But medicine at this moment in the 1840s was an unusually clear way to prove this point about what women could do. Medicine was redefining itself in this mid-19th century moment, both scientifically and institutionally. To this point, it had been a trade plied mostly by midwives and barber surgeons, the village doctor who became such by apprenticing to the previous village doctor. But increasingly in the United States, there were medical schools, and medicine was becoming a profession applied by men who had been to medical school and gotten a diploma. So it occurred to Elizabeth Blackwell that if she could find her way into one of these medical schools and go to all the lectures and pass all of the examinations, who could argue that she wasn't just as well qualified to be a doctor? So that's what she did. Medical school at this point, as this cartoon from 1825 suggests, was not a rigorous thing. It's not the culminating academic achievement kind of path that it is today. Medical school in that moment consisted of 2 consecutive 16-week terms that were identical to each other. You spent the winter going to lectures, just going to lectures and taking notes. You never saw a patient, a live person. Maybe you saw some specimens and dissected them if you were lucky. You sat through the lectures for 16 weeks, you went away for the summer and scraped up some practical experience, and then you came back and did it again, and then you were a doctor with an alarming level of ignorance. So the challenge of this was relatively low. Elizabeth Blackwell rightly had a very high opinion of her own intellectual powers, and she knew that she could do this if they would only let her try. So she, at the age of 26, wrestled her way into a tiny rural provincial medical school in Geneva, New York, Geneva Medical College. Today, the descendant institution is Hobart and William Smith. On the left, the medical department building as it stood, it no longer stands. On the right, the spot where it used to be. She found her way to Geneva Medical College if you read her memoir, written half a century later, you get a rather heroic version where she tried and tried and failed and finally tried one more time and got an acceptance letter and off she went. The reality was a little bit more farcical. Apparently what really happened was that she had been studying privately with a rather prominent physician in Philadelphia who had written her a letter of endorsement when she sent her application letter to Geneva. And the faculty at Geneva weren't quite bold enough to reject his recommendation. But they also really didn't want a woman at their college. That was appalling. Women didn't belong in a medical college. Women studying the functions of the body alongside men. It's just, what woman would want that? But they weren't quite brave enough to say no out of hand. So what they did was they punted. They gave the question to the students. Now remember, this was a provincial medical school full of boisterous boys who weren't quite clever enough to study the law. And they immediately, so the professors told the students, okay, students, here's this question. Of course, it's out of the question. If any one of you says, no, this is out of the question, we will say no to this young woman, assuming that somebody would have an objection. We all have an objection. But the students, realizing that their professors were too cowardly to say no themselves, and that this was an opportunity for very good fun, held a meeting that night and basically bludgeoned into submission any of their number who had doubts about admitting a woman. And the next morning returned their unanimous decision to admit her to the faculty in triumph, and then forgot all about it because most of them assumed it was a prank being played on them by a neighboring medical school. They forgot about it until 3 weeks later when Elizabeth Blackwell walked into the lecture hall. Interestingly, she includes that story as an appendix to her memoir. She includes the story told by one of her original classmates. So she acknowledged that this had happened, but she wasn't going to put it up front. Anyway, once admitted to Geneva Medical College, she quickly blew by all of her classmates in terms of skill and success. And she really began to warm to her subject because as soon as she was able to study specimens and listen to professors rather than just reading medical textbooks, some of the information kind of came alive. She began to think, this could be intellectually stimulating. In between the terms at Geneva, she went back to Philadelphia and found her way to a resident assistantship at Blockley Almshouse, which was the largest municipal almshouse, public hospital in the country at the time. It was essentially a warehouse for the destitute. It was where you ended up if you had nowhere else to go and if you were ill. Her room was off the female syphilis ward. And since it's dinner time, I'm not going to put up slides of what tertiary syphilis looked like in the late 1840s. It was not pretty. And this was where, from having no practical experience in medicine, she suddenly had more than she could handle. And she started to learn a lot about bigger ideas like the connection between poverty and disease, the connection between sexual licentiousness and sexually transmitted disease, epidemic disease. This was the summer of 1848, and waves of Irish refugees were arriving infected with what was then called ship fever, now known as typhus. Elizabeth chose to study these infected immigrants as the basis for her thesis, which she wrote about ship fever. And when she graduated at the top of her class in 1849, it was published in the Buffalo Medical Journal. I mean, this woman was like a comet. She was like a streak of light across the sky, an incredible talent. Interestingly, she chose a thesis subject that had nothing to do with gendered medicine. She wasn't going to do a thesis about obstetrics or women's diseases. She chose something neutral. And then she needed some more practical training because, again, she had graduated with an alarming level of ignorance, as one did. So she did what a lot of newly minted MDs in America did and leave for Europe, where the practical instruction was easier to come by. So she went to Paris. And she made an interesting choice. This is an old convent in the center of Paris where I visited. I took this picture 2 years ago. It housed a large public maternity hospital that was a training hospital for young women from all over France to come and learn how to be midwives. And they lived in dormitories, and they were kind of, state students until they went back to their provinces to be state trained midwives. Now, Elizabeth already had a medical degree, but she made the interesting choice to commit to being a student in this hospital, essentially living in a dorm with the other students, because of the volume of obstetric cases that she would be able to see. And it was a wise choice. She did learn a tremendous amount about obstetric medicine. She also, in this setting, had a crisis which changed sort of the shape of her career, if not its direction. As I said, this was a public maternity hospital. If you had any money at all, you delivered your baby at home. So if you were here, you were a poor woman, a destitute woman, maybe a prostitute. Many of the women who delivered here had sexually transmitted diseases. And when a baby is born to a woman who is infected with gonorrhea in this instance, and passes through the birth canal, the baby is often infected with something called gonorrheal conjunctivitis. It's an eye infection. And Elizabeth was tending to one of these infants and washing out its infected eye when some of the water, the liquid, splashed into her face. And she contracted gonorrheal conjunctivitis, which today would be treated no problem with antibiotics, but in 1849 was a crisis. So she was immediately confined to bed in the same hospital where she had been working, and spent 3 weeks bedridden and unsure whether she was going to retain her sight at all. This is a good place to pause and show you behind the scenes of what it's like to try and write the story 150 years later of someone whose crisis is being told from different points of view. Elizabeth had befriended one of the attending physicians at La Maternité, the wonderfully named Hippolyte Blot, who's also rather easy on the eyes. She writes in her memoir later about this crisis like this: how dreadful it was to find the daylight gradually fading as my kind doctor bent over me and removed with an exquisite delicacy of touch the films that had formed over the pupil. I could see him for a moment clearly, but the sight soon vanished and the eye was left in darkness, right? It's sort of like a romance novel. At the same time that Hippolyte Blot, Dr. Blot, was looking after her very assiduously and carefully, Elizabeth's eldest sister, Anna Blackwell, also happened to be in Paris at the time and was helping to look after her. Anna was a Class A drama queen and a journalist. So she was writing back to the family at home about Elizabeth's crisis, and she was writing in a very different light. This was Anna writing like this: the pupil presents just now the appearance of one of those little misshapen blackberries of 3 granulations and half dried up that one sees so often on some scrubby little bush. If you can fancy one such in dull-looking lead, you have just the appearance of this poor eye. So, yuck. This is sort of what you are up against when you're trying to braid together all of the perspectives from the past and trying to get closer and closer to what might have actually been the truth of the matter. So Elizabeth eventually lost one eye and was fitted for a glass prosthetic. If you squint hard at this photograph taken afterward, you can tell that there's an asymmetry in her gaze, but most people, she never spoke of it, and most people didn't realize that she only had one eye. But it did limit her practice as a doctor. She could no longer really be a decent surgeon, and it spurred her down in a direction that she was already oriented toward, which was more toward public health, more thinking about medicine than actually practicing medicine. And this would continue in her career. Instead of fleeing home to convalesce, she went on to London, where she continued to study at St. Bartholomew's Hospital and made the acquaintance of Florence Nightingale. Now, this is 1851 now. Florence Nightingale is not yet Florence Nightingale. She is just a young woman from a wealthy family eager to marry her off. And she is very eager to do the opposite and pursue her ideas about public health and about a woman's role in the health field. And here's Elizabeth Blackwell, who has left her family behind in America, won a medical degree, is studying independently, and they have this sort of rapturous friendship at first, where they share all the ideas that they have and kind of inspire each other that what they think they'd like to do is actually possible. They eventually, though, bump up against a set of differences that they never quite surmount, which is that Florence Nightingale believed that the role of women in health was as a nurse. And Elizabeth firmly believed that her role, her mission individually, was to prove that women could be doctors. And they never were able to reconcile that difference. But Elizabeth would go on to use a lot of Florence Nightingale's ideas about hygiene and always quite envy some of the global celebrities she ended up winning that Elizabeth Blackwell never quite matched. So after London, Elizabeth returned to New York City. New York, here we are, the New York part of the story. And expected that she would be able to hang out a shingle and that women who wanted to consult a woman doctor about their intimate illnesses would flock to her door. But that didn't happen, because in the early 1850s in New York City, the very phrase female physician meant someone like Madame Rastel, the notorious Fifth Avenue abortionist, here in a cartoon from the National Police Gazette, being compared to a baby-eating demon. Female physician meant abortionist. It meant someone operating on the wrong side of the law, in the shadows, in sin. I mean, the truth is that Madame Rastel and Elizabeth Blackwell were really two sides of the same coin. They were both women who didn't really care about busting ideas about what women could do, and they were very interested and passionate about women's health. They were just coming at it from two different angles. But for Elizabeth Blackwell's purposes, Madame Rastel was the enemy, because as long as people equated them, Elizabeth Blackwell was not going to be able to do what she did and remain respectable. A problem. And so she kind of languished in New York, trying to make ends meet without a lot of paying patients and waiting for her sister, Emily, who she had sort of anointed to follow her into medicine. Emily was 5 years younger. Elizabeth, recognizing that her path into medicine was going to be a lonely one, had kind of chosen her, declared, Emily, you will follow me into medicine. And Emily did, and turned out actually to be a more natural scientist and practitioner than Elizabeth ever was. Emily struggled at least as hard to get her place in a medical school, because by now the men's medical schools had shut their doors even more firmly against women because Elizabeth Blackwell had been so successful. But she persevered and eventually took her medical degree from Cleveland Medical College, which is now part of Case Western. And then she like her sister, went off to Europe to get the practical training that she hadn't had yet. She went to Edinburgh, another major center of medical training, where she apprenticed herself to the larger-than-life James Young Simpson. He was a big deal in British medicine. He was the discoverer of the anesthetic properties of chloroform. He was physician to the Queen. He was a big deal at the University of Edinburgh. And he was something of a showman who really kind of liked, I think, the shock value of having a female assistant among his practice. Emily learned a great deal about obstetric medicine. He was an obstetrician, including the use of instruments like this. At the top, a pessary, which would have been inserted into the vagina to help against uterine prolapse, an all too frequent occurrence in women who had had too many pregnancies in an era before birth control. At the bottom, Simpson's own invention, the uterine sound. He was a pioneer of the pelvic exam and had invented this in order to take cervical measurements. Emily wrote about all this to poor Elizabeth, who was sitting very bored and broke in New York. You can see those two instruments on the left in this letter. She's sketching them to Elizabeth to show her what she's learning and describe how they're used. It was very important to me in this book to make this a double biography, a story of both sisters, which hadn't really been done before. Elizabeth, as the first, tends to blot out Emily, the third woman doctor. But I really felt like Emily had been instrumental in Elizabeth's success, and that this was a story of two sisters pursuing something formidable. However, one of the reasons there aren't a lot of books about Emily is that there isn't as much material about Emily And that can pose a problem when you want to tell a balanced story. So one of the things you can do as a researcher when you're trying to kind of deepen the material that might be a little thin in places is you can go where they went and walk where they walked and try to hold what they held. So I went to Edinburgh and followed Emily all around. This is 52 Queen Street, the middle building. That was James Young Simpson's house, which still stands. It's the only house in the row with the extra story because his household was just bursting at the seams when it came to patients and friends and family. And Emily would come here every day. And when I walked by to take the picture, the door was open. So in the spirit of following in the footsteps, I walked in. It's now a drug rehabilitation center, so it wasn't exactly trespassing. I walked in and just kind of felt what Emily would have felt as she walked around in James Young Simpson's offices each day. For instance, the banisters up to the second floor, which were worked with his initials, tells you something not just about the place, but about a guy who would put his initials in the banister. James Young Simpson was larger than life. And so that kind of deepened my sense of what their working relationship might have been like. Then I wandered all over Edinburgh and went to the Royal College of Surgeons, to their pathology museum, and found all sorts of artifacts. James Young Simpson's pill case on the left there that says, "Please return to 52 Queen Street" under the lid. His stethoscopes there on the lower left made of ivory and rosewood, his belt buckle and his quill, and just generally got a more sensory idea of what Emily's life in Edinburgh would have been like. Those are treasure hunting trips that I adore making. So Emily finally finished her training in Edinburgh. Emily and Elizabeth are both now fairly formidable medical minds at this point, but they're still coming in for snark like this. This is a caricature in Punch, the London satirical newspaper, from the end of Emily's time in Edinburgh. This is meant to be Emily wearing scandalous bloomers, with a rather mannish profile and a ridiculous hat, looking through her spectacles at the only patient she could attract, a lapdog, being held by an appropriately feminine female wearing a corset, as one should. This is the kind of attitude that most of the public had toward the very idea of a woman doctor. And so Emily came back to New York to join Elizabeth. And because private patients just were not forthcoming, what they decided to do was open an infirmary, the New York Infirmary for Indigent Women and Children. Its original home is in a building that still stands on the corner of Bleecker and Crosby at the edge of the Village. As it was on the left and as it is today. It was the first hospital staffed entirely by women. And their intent here wasn't just to create a place for poor women to consult doctors of their own gender, but also to create a place for the slowly growing numbers of female medical graduates to have a place to study, to get the practical training that you need when you come out of medical school. I was lucky enough to befriend the woman who owns and is restoring this building, Jill Plattner, and she gave me access to the inside of the building. This is what it looks like from Crosby Street. And she's restoring it from the inside out. So I know this is an untapped New York crowd who likes to get inside old buildings. I certainly do. This was the second floor renovation going on. You can see one of the hearths. There was a hearth in each corner, the original brickwork, the original gorgeous, huge sash windows front and back. A little close up on one of the corner hearths. Definitely the ghosts were close. And Jill was generous enough to let me write the chapter about the infirmary in the infirmary at her kitchen table, which was just a joy. This is now several months later. The renovation is getting completed. She is a jewelry designer, and this is part of her workshop. This is the second floor, and if you've read the book, the prologue, which involves the dedication ceremony for the infirmary, I firmly believe that it happened right here. These are the windows that face Bleecker Street. I think that that scene happened right here, which is kind of fun. Let's see. The Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation put a plaque on the building a couple of years ago, in 2018. And that on the right is Jane Carey Blackwell Bloomfield, one of the Blackwell descendants who was there to mark the occasion. This was one of those moments that really crystallized for me that history doesn't fit on a plaque. This is a great plaque as far as it goes. It's very accurate and informative, but there is, you already know just from listening to me talk for 20 minutes that there's so much more to this story that doesn't fit. And that really galvanized me to finish this project. So after they finished after they founded the infirmary, it didn't last long at that venue. It quickly moved to 2nd Avenue and 8th Street. If you're familiar with Lower 2nd Avenue, the theater where Stomp has been for years and years is where this stood. At the building, these are the buildings have fallen and risen again, but that's the place. They moved the infirmary there and quickly were distracted from their project by the major cataclysm of the early 1860s, the Civil War. After the first shots rang out in April 1861, the Blackwell sisters called a meeting in the infirmary for their major donors and supporters, and drafted this that ran in the New York Times, an appeal to the women of New York, and especially to those already engaged in preparing against the time of wounds and sickness in the army. They invited people. There was a lot of chaotic energy being aimed at the Union cause, and it needed to be organized. So they invited people, women who were interested, to come to Cooper Union the next day. If you've walked down by Astor Place, you've seen this big building at the top of Cooper Square. Still stands with its great hall underneath. And in response to that appeal, thousands of women showed up at Cooper Union to form what was then called the Women's Central Association of Relief, and which grew directly into the U.S. Sanitary Commission. So you can draw a straight line, if you care to, from the Blackwells to the most important civilian organization of the Civil War. The Blackwells were put in charge of vetting and training nurses to send to the front. They threw themselves into this work because it seemed to them important and very much in line with what they wanted to prove about women. But they quickly ran into a realization that New York's male physicians weren't really interested in working alongside these female physicians. And they were additionally appalled by the appointment of Dorothea Dix to head the nursing effort from Washington. She wasn't a physician. She wasn't a health person at all. They called her the meddler in chief. And they really became a little frustrated and disillusioned, and they eventually withdrew their energies from the war effort to focus on the next challenge for them, the next goal. A goal which sort of surprised them. As I mentioned, women's medical colleges had begun to emerge in Boston and in Philadelphia. The Blackwells scorned separate institutions for women's medical education. They believed women and men should be educated together at the same high level. But women's medical colleges, kind of by definition, were mediocre compared to their male counterparts. And so they became frustrated that women, even though there was a place for them to study medicine, there wasn't a place for them to study it well or hard. So from having the attitude that women's medical colleges were a bad idea, they did an about face and decided to found one of their own at the level that they thought was appropriate, the level of rigor. So they founded their own women's medical college in 1869 that had a longer term, a more intense curriculum, a progressive curriculum, a lot more training at the bedside. In fact, it was more rigorous than the medical schools they themselves had attended. And that was just their professional lives. Personally, the Blackwells were equally fascinating. Both Emily and Elizabeth Blackwell adopted daughters in very different ways, and that comes out in the story. Emily Blackwell lived with her female partner for the last several decades of her life, another physician who had trained with the Blackwells called Elizabeth Cushier. Two of the Blackwell brothers married two of the most prominent I'm sorry, that's not the right slide. I don't have that slide. Sorry. Two of the brothers married two of the most prominent feminists of the day, Lucy Stone and Antoinette Brown. Lucy Stone, a huge women's suffrage advocate, and Antoinette Brown, the first woman to be ordained as a minister. And even as their brothers married these prominent leaders of the women's movement, Elizabeth and Emily didn't agree with them. They didn't agree with the women's rights movement because they didn't believe in prioritizing women's suffrage. To them, it seemed strange to give the vote to women before women had shaken off the oppression, really, of their men. Why give the vote to a woman if she's just going to vote like her husband does? Isn't the most important thing to help women claim their own independence first? So there was a fundamental difference there between the Blackwells and the women's movement. And then there were differences between the Blackwell sisters themselves. Even as they built these institutions together, they disagreed with each other about the role of women doctors. Elizabeth on the left, as I said, was motivated more and more toward public health, the idea that a woman doctor was a teacher armed with science. Whereas Emily, the scientist, the practitioner, was really interested in new techniques. She thought the role of a woman in medicine was to be as good in medicine as any man, as a surgeon, as a practitioner, as a medical professor. And once their institutions were founded, they kind of gratefully parted ways and spent the last 40 years of their lives on separate continents. Elizabeth went back to Britain, where she had always preferred to be, and pursued issues like moral reform, public health issues that required her to speak and write a lot more than she actually practiced medicine. Whereas Emily stayed in New York and ran the college and the infirmary for the next several decades. In fact, sustaining her sister's legacy almost to the detriment of her own. So that's the outline of the story. And this moment, as we celebrate our first female vice president, it feels like a particularly good one for the Blackwells, because this is a story that, to me, its larger meaning has to do with heroines and how we see them. I want to end with this photograph, which always intrigues me. This is a photograph at the Museum of the City of New York. It is cataloged as a woman, possibly Elizabeth Blackwell. She looks like a perfect late Victorian maiden, rather dewy, has a lovely gaze and a Mona Lisa smile. If you look at the back of the photo, it quickly becomes clear that this couldn't possibly be Elizabeth Blackwell. Dana's photo portrait gallery on 14th and 6th didn't exist until 1885. And in 1885, Elizabeth Blackwell, who was born in 1821, didn't look anything like this. Yet when you Google Elizabeth Blackwell and you go to images, this image comes up over and over and over again. I've seen it on movies, on websites, on even on a biography or two. And it's fascinating to me that this is such a persistent mistake, that people want this photo, despite the fact that the evidence on the back of the photo disproves that it could possibly be Elizabeth. They want it to be what Elizabeth Blackwell looks like. And to me, that's kind of the crux of it, because the Blackwells were not perky or pretty. They were not interested in pleasing anyone. They were complicated and prickly and imperfect and very real. They were the kind of women who changed the world, and it's important to be able to hold their imperfections alongside their accomplishment in order to honor them. So thanks for listening. I'd be really happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you so much. That was super informative, and presentation had a great flow, so it was very enjoyable. We do have a couple questions. I have one. I feel like the term, first woman blank has been coming up a lot recently, because not just with Kamala Harris, but a lot of the appointees. And I had a friend who recently posted like that he's just kind of amazed that these phrases are coming out, because he didn't realize that so many positions in government had never been filled by a woman. Right. So I was just curious whether you thought the sisters would have liked that being called the first something, or would they have bristled at it?
Yeah, I think Elizabeth Blackwell was very proud of being the first woman doctor. I think, as I said, she was somebody with healthy self-esteem. She went into medicine not because she liked medicine, but because she wanted to prove something. And being the first is sort of an incontrovertible proof that that you are different and bigger and better and all of that. Yeah, she did not shy away from the not the notoriety of it, but the positive notoriety of it, the fame of it. I think it was very important to her that she had achieved that as the first.
Cool. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I believe Justin is back. Justin, are you back?
Yes. I'm here. Can you hear me? Hi, Janice.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hey.
Sorry about some of the technical difficulties that we had before. Janice and I had some issues connecting, but I'm here, and thank you, Michelle, for coming in.
Yeah.
We do have some questions coming in from the insiders. One of which is, well, we have Judith Birdie on here with us today, who is the head of the Roosevelt Island Historical Society.
Oh, nice.
And the question came up not from her, but from Rena Toby, who's one of our insiders. I was a little late. Sorry if this has been covered. Just skip it. Is there a connection to Blackwell's Island? And it wasn't covered, so.
Right. And it's a good question. And no, alas, there is no connection. The Blackwell's Island was named for a farmer who owned the land in at least the 18th century. Blackwell is not that uncommon a name, but it always amused me that Blackwell's Island was called Blackwell's Island, because you saw me refer to Madame Restel, the notorious Fifth Avenue abortionist, who actually, just as Elizabeth Blackwell was going to medical school triumphantly, Madame Restel was going to prison for committing abortion on Blackwell's Island. And both of these stories were in the newspapers. So I always thought that Elizabeth Blackwell was sort of haunted by those connections, that in mid 19th century New York, Blackwell was associated with all of the bad things that were on Blackwell's Island, the sanatorium, the prison, the asylum, all those things.
Well, there it is.
There it
is. Joe Holmes from London. Hi, Joe. How are you? Don't know if I missed it, but who was the second female doctor in the US, and do you know what happened to her?
You did not miss it. It always begs the question, who is that? And there's a good story in there. So the second female to receive a medical degree in the United States, and this is mainstream medical degree. There are certain gradations where it gets gray, but the kind of medical degree that Elizabeth and Emily were going for from a men's institution was a woman named Nancy Talbot Clark, who actually received her diploma from the same place that Emily did just beforehand. And I always think it's very interesting because here's a woman who was achieving just what the Blackwell sisters were achieving. You would think, you would hope that there would be sisterhood between them, that they would join forces, that they would be, superheroes together. But no, and this is a thread that runs through this whole story and the present that I think is really important, which is female misogyny. The Blackwells, having struggled to get where they got, were very, very wary of other women who might undermine or taint their achievement. They referred to Nancy Clark always as Little Mrs. Clark. This despite the fact that she had achieved just what they had achieved. And it was very interesting to me to watch them kind of draw aside from her a little bit, watching her to make sure that she wasn't going to embarrass them in any way, that she wasn't going to make the men around them dismiss the idea of women in medicine. So an all too recognizable and relatable moment.
We've got a few questions and comments from Judith Birdie from Roosevelt Island. And first she comments that they think that Madame Restel was a prisoner on Blackwell's Island.
Yes.
And she asks, did their medical institution stay in business or become another institution?
Yes to both. Yes, and the New York Infirmary for Women and Children, the indigent got dropped after a while. Persisted. It existed at Livingston Square until the 80s, and then the 1980s, and then became sort of subsumed into NYU downtown, and now it's part of Weill Cornell. As hospitals are sort of like publishing houses, they kind of all eat each other over and over again.
But yeah, they all become the same hospital,
right? With many names.
Yeah,
but
dash.
It is still the DNA of the Blackwells Infirmary is now part of New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell as downtown, which is downtown hospital on William Street. But they still have some of the artifacts but yeah,
That's literally the hospital I was thinking about with
right.
all the dashes.
Exactly.
Michelle Korn, who she says, forgive me, I may have missed this in the start of the talk. She is a doctor and she's on call, but she, so I think that's pretty cool. Thank you for joining us, Michelle. She said, what sparked your interest in this topic?
Yeah, to do this kind of work, which requires sustaining your interest over years of research, travel, writing, editing, you really it has to connect with something inside yourself. My first book was about 19th century Japan and America, and that grew out of my own family's story. My husband was born in Tokyo. We lived there for several years, and I was interested in the convergence of the first convergence of the United States and Japan, because it was part of who I am. And then when I finished that project and sort of said, okay, what else is in there that I can use? As I mentioned, I had grown up at a girls' school as the math science kid, and hit college fully intending to study medicine, and then was seduced by the humanities. But medicine was always sort of the path not taken, and a passion. I'm still a science kid. And then as I was casting about for a new project, my daughter was coming of age and deciding she wanted to be a doctor. She is now most of the way through college and still devotedly pre-med. And so that was another sort of circling back. And then to discover that this first women in medicine story was a New York story, that the building is there on Bleecker Street, sort of kind of cemented that. And the deeper I went into their materials, the more it felt like a story that was ripe for two women who were ripe for reintroduction to the present.
Yeah, definitely.
That's great. We've got Heather asking, do you feel compelled to correct the misattribution of Elizabeth's photo?
Yes, I just did. It's funny. I wrote an essay about it that was published in Smithsonian 2 weeks ago. You can go back and find it, or maybe I can find it and put it in the chat. And then I was amused when people who know me were still posting that photo. Even I was like, did you read the essay? So no, I'm not shy about saying that that's not her. I love that it exists though, because I think it tells such a good story about our implicit biases about women and how they need to be in order to win our admiration. I think it's an important thing for us to acknowledge and let go of.
Very true. And also, I'm going to give a shout out to Heather. Heather who asked the question, is one of our guides. I believe it's still up in Albany. Glad you joined us, Heather. Joe asks, was the sister journalist a trailblazer as well?
Yeah, although not in the way that puts you on the children's biography shelf.
Right.
She was a translator of George Sand. She was a translator of Charles Fourier, who was a sort of a utopian thinker. She was the first Blackwell to decamp back to Europe and never came back to America. She really preferred Europe because she was the oldest. So she had been the oldest when she got here, never really identified as American. And she spent a lot of time in Paris writing for American newspapers about sort of, the gossip from Paris. She was a woman alone earning her living. So there's interest there. She also was kind of a hypochondriac who was always interested in the latest medical fad or cultural fad. She spent a little bit of time at Brook Farm up by Boston, exploring utopianism. She was always pursuing the water cure or magnetism.
Yes.
Sorry?
I said the water cure. Yes, the Roebling's downfall.
Right. Yeah. And it was interesting. There's an interesting interplay there where she kept crossing paths with Elizabeth and spending time with her. Elizabeth would kind of raise an eyebrow at some of her faddish excitement, but also pay attention because she was very open-minded as medicine was changing, rapidly. No one really knew whether any of these fads might have some truth in them. And it was interesting to watch Elizabeth and Emily both kind of talk about committing heresy with intelligence and weaving in some of these sort of more fringy ideas that might have some benefit to them, like cold water and fresh air, which there's nothing wrong with those, as we all know right now. So
Janet says that she just walked by. She just found her place on Crosby while walking in NYC.
Nice.
Very cool, Janet. Michelle posted the link to your other book as well.
Yeah, I'm excited. I actually just bought it as we were on this call and chatting. But yeah, like my family is not Japanese, but my grandparents grew up under Japanese occupation in Taiwan. And so they speak fluent Japanese. And my grandfather was there when they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. So it's this crazy like backstory of my family that's very tied to Japan. And so I'm looking forward to reading your book and kind of learning more about the other side of the pond.
Yeah, no, it's a good story.
Yeah, great. Is there, do you have any other questions from the folks out there? All right, well, I'll put one last link to the book.
Yeah, and Janet says, thank you, so amazing.
Thank you so much.
It really was a great presentation, very thorough, very, the visuals were great. We loved getting into the house on Crosby. That was a really great.
Right. Well, that
yeah, so cool.
Was a great treat.
And again, Michelle just put the link again to the book, The Doctors Blackwell, in the chat. And Lorraine says, fascinating story. Thanks, Lorraine, coming to us from Asheville. I think she described it as
Asheville. Asheville's in the book.
Ooh, there you go.
So Elizabeth Blackwell taught in Asheville before she got to medical school, and was confronted with the reality of living in slave territory after a lifetime of idealistically supporting abolitionism. She was a little shocked by what she found when actually living there. So it's good.
Oh, wow. Lorraine says we have a plaque here for her in Asheville.
Exactly. That's right. I've seen it.
Oh, cool. And then Marie has a last question. Did Elizabeth become a U.S. citizen?
She did, actually. I'm not sure if it was a strategic thing or not. She became a U.S. citizen just as she left. She got her medical degree, became a citizen, and then left to go study in Paris. And there's a question about whether maybe she did that strategically because the French didn't despise the Americans as much as they despised the English at that point. So that going to study in Paris might have been easier on an American passport than on a British one, because Elizabeth did not ever think of herself really as an American. She was grateful for America as a place to kind of bust customs and become something new. But as far as a culture to live in, she preferred the old country.
Great.
Awesome. So any last questions? Oh, did we get another one come through in the Q&A? Let's see.
No, I think, oh, wait, let's see. Oh, no, Judy just says, excellent presentation, great work and research. So let's quickly, in the last minute, just talk about what's coming up next. So tomorrow we've got Richard will be back doing Transformation of the Lower East Side Part 2. And I know the first one, people excitedly ate that up. And then Friday, we have Jeff Rubin, who's been a longtime writer for us, and really an Upper Manhattan Bronx expert. And he is going to go through the Bronx's tallest buildings. So a borough no one really thinks about as having tall buildings, but there are a bunch, and he's going to talk about the architecture and history of those. So please register for those, and we'll see you the rest of this week. Thank you, Janice.
Thank you, Janice,
so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Good luck with all of your presentations, I'm sure are coming up.
Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Good to see everybody. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.